The golden age of the automobile was a time of unbridled imagination and engineering audacity. Between the years 1950 and 1989, the car was more than just a tool for transportation. It was a rolling canvas of cultural expression and a laboratory for experimental technology. Designers across the globe pushed the limits of physics and aesthetic appeal, often prioritizing style and novelty over the mundane concerns of safety and environmental preservation. During these 4 decades, features were introduced that now seem like relics from a distant and more dangerous galaxy. Today, we step back into this era to examine the strange and forgotten features that were once standard but are now strictly illegal. To understand why these features existed, we must first understand the spirit of the mid-20th century. In the 1950s, the world was obsessed with the space race and the promise of a jet-age future. This fascination manifested in the most iconic and dangerous design feature of the decade, the tail fin. Championed by legendary designers like Harley Earl at General Motors, these massive chrome-tipped appendages on the rear of vehicles like the 1959 Cadillac Eldorado served no aerodynamic purpose. Instead, they were meant to evoke the majesty of a fighter jet. However, these sharp metal protrusions were essentially knives on wheels. In an era before modern pedestrian safety standards, a low-speed collision with the rear of a parked car could result in gruesome impalement. By the late 1960s, safety advocates like Ralph Nader began to point out the absurdity of prioritizing chrome and fins over human life. New regulations eventually mandated that car exteriors be smoother and less aggressive, or in regulatory terms, pedestrian-friendly. Moving from the exterior to the interior, we encounter a feature that seems unthinkable to a modern parent: the lack of seatbelts and the presence of metal dashboards. Throughout the 1950s and well into the 1960s, many cars were sold without any form of restraint system. The dashboard was often a solid piece of painted steel, occasionally decorated with sharp metal knobs and protruding switchgear. In a sudden deceleration, the human body became a projectile traveling toward a solid metal wall. It was not until the late 1960s that federal motor vehicle safety standards began to mandate padded dashboards and lap belts. Even then, the transition was slow. For years, manufacturers fought against these changes, claiming that safety features would make cars too expensive or suggest to consumers that driving was inherently dangerous. One of the most peculiar and hazardous features of the late 1950s was the dashboard-mounted record player. Before the advent of 8-track tapes or cassettes, Chrysler introduced a system called Highway Hi-Fi. It was a miniature phonograph that sat just below the instrument panel. While it featured a heavier stylus and a floating mechanism to prevent skipping over bumps, it was a massive distraction for the driver. Trying to change a delicate vinyl record while navigating a highway at 60 miles per hour was a recipe for disaster. Furthermore, in an accident, the heavy metal arm and the records themselves became shrapnel. The legal framework today regarding distracted driving and interior projections has long since relegated the dashboard turntable to the museum of bad ideas. As we moved into the 1960s and 70s, lighting became a frontier for both style and illegality. Mention must be made of the pop-up headlamp. While not strictly illegal to own today, modern safety regulations have effectively banned them from new production. The reason is twofold. First, the sharp edges of the raised headlight housing presented a severe hazard to pedestrians in an impact. Second, the mechanical reliability of these units was often poor. If a motor failed at night, a driver could find themselves blind on a dark road. Today, cars are designed with integrated light clusters that must meet strict height and visibility requirements, while maintaining a smooth profile that allows a body to roll over the hood rather than being caught by a mechanical housing. Another lighting feature that fell victim to the law was the use of colored auxiliary lights. In the 1970s, it was not uncommon to see cars with green or blue accent lights on the front or undercarriage. However, as emergency services standardized their lighting colors, laws were passed to ensure that only police, fire, and medical vehicles could utilize certain colors. Blue and red became strictly protected, and even yellow or orange lights were subject to rigid placement rules. The goal was to eliminate confusion on the road, ensuring that a driver could instantly recognize an emergency vehicle through a rearview mirror. One of the most dangerous trends of the 1970s was the swiveling bucket seat. Seen in cars like the Chevrolet Monte Carlo and the Oldsmobile Cutlass, these seats could rotate 90 degrees to help passengers exit the vehicle with ease. While the convenience was undeniable, the structural integrity was lacking. In a side impact collision, the locking mechanisms were often unable to withstand the force, causing the seat to break free from its moorings. Modern cars require seats to be anchored to the frame with high-tensile bolts and reinforced steel frames, a standard that the stylish swivel seats of the 70s could never meet. In the 1980s, the obsession with automation led to one of the most hated and eventually banned safety features: the automatic motorized seatbelt. In an effort to bypass the requirement for airbags, many manufacturers installed belts that would slide along a track on the doorframe when the door closed, supposedly securing the passenger without them having to lift a finger. These systems were often poorly designed, frequently failing to secure the waist strap, or worse, trapping occupants in a vehicle after a crash if the electrical system failed. By the early 1990s, when driver and passenger airbags became mandatory in the United States, these motorized death traps were quickly phased out and eventually outlawed in favor of traditional three-point manual belts. We cannot discuss this era without mentioning the environmental impact of certain features. Up until the late 1970s, the leaded gasoline used in high-performance engines was a major public health crisis. The vehicles themselves were designed with open crankcase ventilation systems in the early part of this era, which allowed oily vapors and unburned fuel to simply vent into the atmosphere. The introduction of the catalytic converter in 1975 changed everything. Suddenly, the lead in the fuel would clog the converters, and the toxic fumes had to be recirculated through the engine. The wide-open, high-polluting exhaust systems of the 1960s muscle cars became relics. Today, tampering with or removing a catalytic converter is a federal offense in many jurisdictions, a stark contrast to the era when performance was measured by how much smoke and noise a car could produce. The 1950s also saw the rise of the liquid-filled bumper. A strange experiment in low-speed impact protection, some transit buses and specialized cars used bumpers filled with water or oil that would squirt out of valves upon impact to dissipate energy. While clever in theory, these were messy, inconsistent, and often left slippery fluids on the roadway, creating hazards for other drivers. Modern energy-absorbing foam and plastic structures have replaced these eccentric hydraulic solutions. Even the way we fueled our cars has changed due to safety laws. In the 1950s and 60s, it was common to find gasoline filler necks hidden behind the rear license plate or even inside the trunk. In the event of a rear-end collision, the fuel tank was in a highly vulnerable position, and the filler neck could easily rupture, spraying gasoline onto hot exhaust pipes. The tragic legacy of the Ford Pinto in the 1970s brought this design flaw to the forefront of the public consciousness. Lawsuits and new safety standards forced manufacturers to move fuel tanks forward of the rear axle and place filler necks on the side of the vehicle, protected by the car's bodywork. Finally, we must look at the glass used in these vintage machines. Before the 1980s, many cars utilized glass that was not sufficiently tempered or laminated. In a crash, this glass would shatter into large, jagged shards that acted like knives. Modern automotive glass is designed to crumble into tiny, harmless granules or stay bonded together in a sheet to prevent ejection. The older, more dangerous glass is now prohibited in new vehicle construction. As we look back at the era from 1950 to 1989, we see a world of trial and error. We see designers who were more concerned with the silhouette of a fender than the survival of a pedestrian. We see a landscape where the freedom to innovate often bypassed the necessity of protection. While we may look at a 1959 Cadillac with its soaring fins, or a 1970s muscle car with its roaring, unfiltered engine with a sense of nostalgia, we must also recognize that these features are gone for a reason. The evolution of the automobile is a story of learning from our mistakes. Each law passed and each feature banned represents a life saved or an accident prevented. The chrome, the fins, and the motorized belts belong to a different time, a time when the road was a wild frontier, and the car was a beautiful, dangerous, and unregulated dream. Today, we drive in a world shaped by the lessons of those 4 decades, where beauty must coexist with the absolute priority of safety and the preservation of our environment. The strange features of the past serve as a reminder of how far we have come in our journey on 4 wheels.